What up, witches, and welcome to Witchin and Bitchin, the podcast. I'm your host, Darren.
And I'm Vicky. How are you all? I hope you're doing really, really well. It's getting higher and higher.
It is. Soon we're going to have dogs start barking
Yes.
whenever people are listening to our podcast because your voice just goes higher and higher and higher. So we have an amazing special guest for you all today. So J. Ellen Cross is a practicing witch of Mexican, Native American, and European descent, whose craft was shaped by his Catholic upbringings and mixed family culture. Living in his home state of Oregon, he works as a psychic medium and occult specialist for a well-known paranormal investigation team out of the Portland metro area. When he's not investigating, he enjoys providing spells and potions to his local community, exploring haunted and abandoned places, working as a consultant for other workers and investigators, and of course, writing about witchcraft. You can follow him on Instagram at Oregon_wood_witch. So please join me in welcoming J. Ellen Cross.
Hi, you guys. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's so wonderful to get to talk to you. How are you today?
I'm good. This is my first international podcast, so I'm feeling very, world traveler right now.
I was going to say, isn't it amazing now though, like with Zoom and how it's opened everything up, that it's made it so much more easy to actually speak to people from across the world and to be doing all different things. So we're really excited to have you.
And it's actually made the world so much smaller.
It has.
It really has.
Like you can travel from one side of the world to the other in a split second.
Yeah.
And it's kind of cool. And full disclaimer, everyone. So we're recording this on the day of the solstice. It is the eve of the solstice in the US, but the day of the solstice in Australia. And we have Mercury retrograde. So
who knows?
Yeah, who knows what's going to happen.
Who knows if anybody can form any words or sentences or anything.
Yes.
Whatever happens, happens.
Yeah, that's it. Well, this is a question that we like to ask all of our guests that come on, because it was sort of one of the reasons we created the podcast, was to kind of show that there's not just one way to be a witch, I guess, or to practice your craft. So with that in mind, and this is just your opinion as well and for yourself, how would you define a modern day witch?
A modern day witch. Well, if we're going by modern standards, this would be somebody who dares to explore, especially in a spiritual field. This is somebody who's not afraid to, maybe do some of their own research, maybe step outside of what they were raised with, maybe, takes time to learn about other places and other things too. So it's somebody who really, ventures out to the places that we don't normally reach.
Yeah. I love that. That's beautiful.
I love that.
I'm like, I wish I'd put that one in mine.
Just that little opening thing, dares to explore. I'm like, yes, that gives me the goosebumps. I love it. Every time we ask a guest that question, it just like changes my own personal definition of what it means to be a witch, because I like kind of take a bit of this,
opens things up. Because it does. Cool. It opens to different perspectives and different ways of being, and I love that, exploring other ways. So with that also in mind, do you how do you identify like any particular terms or labels? I mean, for want of a better word, what do you sort of, I guess, call yourself? What terms do you use?
It's so funny because I have been on a bit of a journey around this question about, what exactly is it that I am? Because, I have always classically identified as a witch, but my path has taken such an interesting turn into folk magic, and I'm now identifying as being a Catholic. And, does being a witch still fall into that or not? Are they at complete odds with one another? And whether or not I want to use modern definitions or classical definitions. And recently I've actually been trying to come up with a new name that I can use. And I'm not having the best luck. For some reason, I want to use the term like a charm smith, like someone who makes charms and spells and things like that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't roll off the tongue too well, and people look at you like you are crazy. So I think
lately,
lately I've been going for folk witch, because I think it kind of merges my two worlds together very nicely.
Puts it all
I love
in
that
there.
though. Charm. I have to admit that the teenager in me like likes the fact that it says the word charm in it, because I'm just like, oh, P3, like, Halliwell sisters, like.
Yeah, that's it.
Pour one out for Prue.
Yes.
So I guess like I'd love to like dive into that a little bit more, because as you've touched on, like, and I didn't realize this about you, that you're going on this bit of a journey through Catholicism. See, I'm struggling with Catholicism.
We're all in it together.
Because I actually was raised Catholic, and I actually we were talking about this in the last episode that we recorded, because it was about us for our 50th episode. And I was talking about the fact that I went through Catholicism, like kind of feeling a little bit like an outsider and kind of questioning my own belief system because of how preachy it became. I don't know whether that was just particularly my priest or my church, but so I'm interested to kind of explore that with your origin story. Are we able to like dive into like you rewinding the clock, how you were raised, and then what's influenced you and brought you to today?
Absolutely. So I grew up in a Mexican Catholic family in Northeast Oregon. I was an altar boy for Our Lady of the Valley Catholic Church back in the day.
Yeah.
There are pictures somewhere. But yeah, so that was something that I grew up with as a kid, but we fell away from the church when I was probably 10 or 11, which was just as well, because right around that time I was also very much showing signs of blossoming as not only a witch, but a very gay person. And so leaving the church at about that time, when kind of my parents divorced, which is why my parents kind of stepped away from the church, but that was actually perfect timing for me as well.
Yeah.
So I kind of grew up with this Catholic basis, and then things got a little weird from there, because my family was always very magically inclined, and my mother was adopted, so we didn't know exactly who her family was until I was about 8 or 9 when we met them. But my upbringing, I always thought was very normal, until the other day somebody asked me to write down my witch origin story, and then seeing it there in 3 pages, I was like, oh no, this is very weird. I have a mother who's reading tarot cards at the dinner table for her friends. I remember very vividly this one day where my mother decided to banish a really horrible boss that she had. She brought home this blue candle full of black glass, and she was like, we're gonna get him. And I'm like, okay. All right,
go mom,
we're going. Right. So, you know, I being raised in that manner, and then of course once her birth family gets more comfortable with us, you know, we kind of go through the, oh, you have our hair and our eyes and the family ears and all that. And then after we kind of get past that, they all slowly kind of start coming up to us one at a time, like, does anything weird happen with you guys? And we're like, you know, define weird. And they're like, do you get sad in the bathroom floods? And we're like, oh, we're like, so that's you guys too. And they're like, yes. And so that's when we realized that it was a full family thing. And though my family doesn't really practice a specific like path or tradition of magic, we're just weird, freaky paranormal. A lot of us have different forms of psychic ability. You know, I'm what they call post-cognitive psychic medium, which means I see the past mostly, and I communicate with the dead. But my grandmother used to hear the voice of God. And so she would say, the Heavenly Father is speaking to me. I need to take a left here. And she would just suddenly, you know, whether she should just or not, just all the way over there. But there was usually a reason. And so she would say really interesting things sometimes, and just of what God was telling her. And she was a visionary as well. So she was devoutly Mormon, which was very different. But she would go to temple and she would pray for hours, and then she would have a vision. And that's how she gave the members of our family what she called their Native American names. And so she kind of went through and just kind of bestowed one upon everybody. But she would get them through her visions, which she said came from her Heavenly Father.
Wow,
that's amazing.
Even just that alone, I have so many questions. I'm like, where do we take this? Wow, like that's seriously like just blown my mind. Like here I was thinking, like I had this predisposed idea of what I thought we were going to talk about. We've just like, you've just given me so much more like direction, and where do we take it? Like, I'm keen to know a little bit. So then this whole thing of like, I think it's quite interesting that you, having met your mum's biological family later on, and then finding out that you're all gifted and stuff, like, So what other gifts do people have? Like obviously, if your grandmother is hearing the voice of God, you've got post cognitive
Mhm.
clairvoyance. Is that what the phrase was? Sorry, I'm not familiar with the term, so I was just like I didn't want to say it wrong.
Yeah, I just basically just say post-cognitive psychic medium. I
Yeah.
am clairvoyant and what they call clairsentient, which
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
Feeling
much
vibes.
harder
Yeah.
to explain.
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
one.
yeah,
Yeah.
So what other gifts are there in your family that you know of?
So it depends on which one, because each one of us has something kind of different going on. So I have a cousin who's a channeler,
Yeah.
and she does amazing healing work. Her name is Nadine. And then I also have several cousins that are witches,
Yeah.
and that's kind of one of the categories I fall into as well. And then my mother, she's an animal communicator, or she's a pet psychic.
Wow.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and she gets what she calls the death tingle or the feeling,
Yeah.
because she'll just send me a text message every so often. She goes, I have the tingle, and that means that somebody we know is going to die, generally within about a week or two. And it's very weird when it happens, but it's nice to have that heads up, because
I
she'll
was
just
gonna
send me a
say
message and she's like, I have the feeling, be
something's
careful, don't
happening.
do anything. Yeah.
That's it. Make sure
Yeah.
Wow.
speed limit, all of the stuff.
Yeah. So that's nice to have that around.
That's so cool. Like I'm like, here I am thinking like I read tarot cards. I'm like I call myself clairsentient. I'm like, but damn, I don't have any of that shit going on. Like,
That's the next level.
Sometimes it's best though, because sometimes it's not always good when you know.
I was about to
Yeah.
say, is there that
Yeah.
kind of, I know we often romanticize and fantasize about those kind of things, but is there sort of, how does that kind of affect, I guess, your everyday life? And is there that kind of negative side to it as well?
Always. When I was
Yeah.
growing up, it was really hard because um, I was the only medium in the immediate family. I mean,
Yeah.
my sister was as well, but she was not into talking about it or joining me and my
Yeah.
mom in the weird witchy thing
Yeah.
until much later. Um, but for me, I'm trying to go to school and I'm trying to be very normal.
Yeah.
And not only am I trying to traverse the world of being gay in adolescence, but also there's a dead former teacher trying to ask me questions over my shoulder while I'm trying to pay attention in class, which was very hard for me socially, because
Yeah.
the question came up later in high school. There was a show on A&E for a minute called Psychic Kids, where they would kind of help kids that were going through very similar things.
Yeah.
And at one point, I was actually asked to be on the show. So it came up to,
Oh, wow.
I have to let people know
Yeah.
in my high school that like this is about to happen. I didn't actually end up going on it at the last minute,
Yeah.
but it kind of had to be brought out into the open. And
wow.
you
Wow.
definitely do lose friends. People make up their mind about
Yeah.
you. And then, of course, after that, going into college and dating as
Yes.
someone who has to say, like, just so you know, I see dead people.
Yeah.
So I occasionally have to have a
Would you like to-
conversation with just like the empty corner.
Yeah.
And it's totally normal, I promise.
It's all fine. I promise.
Wow.
Right.
Like, and I guess that would be one of the hardest things to have to navigate. Like we literally, well, we only just spoke about as well in a previous episode about coming out of the broom closet, because in honor of pride, we're talking about coming out of the closet, coming out of the broom closet, how they're the same but different. But then here you are going through adolescence,
third one
as a gay kid, having to navigate that, in school, which can sometimes lead to things like bullying and ostracization. Big words are not my best.
I was gonna say not today.
But then to add to that, also the whole witchy side and medium side. It's not like, because I've, like, when I used to sit in psychic development circle, I know what it's like to sometimes be on a train and then you just have this random dead person just pop up and say, can you give a message to them? And it literally gets to the point where you almost look like that crazy schizophrenic person as they go away to the nothing that's there. And people look at you like you're the weird one.
Yeah.
But, so I totally get it. But like, I guess, how did you navigate that? Like, did you have a support network around you? I'm saying this for our viewers, like if anyone's going through similar things.
Yeah, I did have a support network around me. My family was very supportive. I did have several friends that did stick with me through the whole thing, which were invaluable. But mostly it came down to just completely owning it as this is me, this is what I do. But at the same time, not feeling like I had anything to prove. Like, if people didn't believe me, that's absolutely fine. My job here is not to convince skeptics. My job here is to connect the dead with the living as much as I can, where I can. And if they're not open to that, then that's fine. They're not part of what I need to be working on here. And so just realizing that I had nothing to prove, and that if I was just very honest about who I am, then a lot of it became much less scary. Because there isn't that looming, like, what if they find out thing. It's, I'm going to tell you on the very first date I talk to dead people. So,
Hi.
So there's no surprises later, just so we're clear.
Can I ask, like, what was the most, what's the standout reaction from when you've said that to someone? Just as a bit of a fun retort, like.
It was so weird because I'd get one of two things. They'd either kind of go, okay, and then change the subject. Or most of the time, though, I did get a lot of guys that were just very much like, wow, that's so interesting. Like, I absolutely accept that. And we're very cool about it until something paranormal actually happened. Because when you date me, things happen. Like the lights begin to flicker. Or I was sitting with a guy I was dating. We were sitting on my bed. We were watching a show, and just past the TV on the door was one of my towels that was hanging there. And the bottom of it just came up like somebody just grabbed it and just lifted it up and then dropped it back down again. And he just turns white and he goes, did you that? And I was like, no, I did not do that. Like, that's not how this works.
That's not mine.
I'm like, that's somebody else. And he's like, oh no. So then they decide whether or not they're actually okay with it after something really happens. But they like to come on, like they're very open-minded.
That would, like, just to see the look on someone's face. I'd love to be a fly on the wall, just to see some. Like, because like even like we say that we're all like okay with this kind of stuff. Like even I myself, like I'm happy to watch any kind of TV show, and even though I know it's like Hollywood, but Paranormal Activity, as much as it's staged, scares the bejesus out of me, because I'm just like, because I believe in that stuff, and because I've been privy to random things happening in places. Like I remember when I was a kid, well, we've all done it, when you're a kid and you do a seance, like, and I say it like this because it wasn't a real one. Like we thought we just like, oh, let's all put our fingers on a glass and and we drew like our own Ouija board out on a piece of paper. By the way, I'm not condoning that anyone does this at home. This is me telling a story. But we drew our own Ouija board and all our fingers on the glass and it was moving around, all this kind of stuff. And then someone's like, oh, you're pushing it. No, you're pushing it. No, you're pushing it. And then they were like, oh, and then people got over it. So they took their fingers off. I'm like, no, guys, you can't take your fingers off. You have to ask it to leave. They're like, oh, as if anything's going to happen. And I sat there with my finger and I'm like, I don't want to take it off. They're like, they literally had to grab my hand and pull it off. And we walked and sat in the other room. Next minute, the glass went flying across the bench, like off the end of the bench and smashed into the wall and then hit the ground. I'm like, okay, no one's finger was on it that time. Freaked out. So it's like, you know, like when you have shit like that happen, you can't kind of deny the paranormal world or paranormal thing. So I guess how did you progress into that field? Because like reading your bio, I didn't actually know that about you. So that's just like, how did you progress into being a paranormal investigator?
Well, it all kind of, I always say that I'm kind of just hanging on to the bumper of spirit and it's just taking me wherever it wants me to go. So when I was a kid, around the age of 7-ish, I suffered from a series of migraines that went on for almost 2 weeks. And I don't remember much from that time other than just laying on the floor crying, like clutching my head, and my parents trying to feed me those little like grape chewable Tylenols or whatever for kids. Nothing helped, and it was just awful. And it was every night for like a week, and it just suddenly stopped. And after it stopped, I began to have dreams, and the dreams were very vivid, and they seemed kind of odd, but then they would happen weeks or months later in my waking life. So it started off with that, and then I got kind of comfortable with this idea about being that I'm psychic at a very early age. I knew exactly what it was, and I was like, okay, fine, like this is a thing.
Okay, it's a thing.
And then I uttered the worst phrase ever, which was, I'm just so glad I'm not one of those people that sees dead people. And then spirit was like, guess what? Dead people everywhere. And so that suddenly kicked in for me and I'm like, oh great, so this is what we're doing. But even at a very, very young age, I had a very strong sense of duty and responsibility with it.
Yeah.
I never thought that it was an accident that I was this way. I knew I was made this way for a specific purpose. And something that was really impactful for me was I told my mom when I was real young, like 10-ish. I was like, I think I'm psychic. I'm like, I just need you to know that this is going on for me.
Yeah.
And at that point, she wasn't tapped into hers yet because all of hers hit slowly after mine. And she comes home the next day. Well, when I tell her, she's just kind of like, okay, like, thank you for letting me know. And she was a hairdresser at the time. And so they have a bunch of, huge stacks of magazines there. And she comes home the next day with a clipping from one of the magazines. And she gives it to me, and I'm going to date myself, but the article was about a new show that was coming out called Medium, all about this woman named Alison Dubois.
Yeah.
And so the article was about Alison Dubois, and she gives it to me and she says, this woman works with the police and she does what you do. And so she's helping people, and you can help people too. And there are other people out there like you.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so I knew, I'm like, okay, this is something I can do something important with.
Yeah.
And I kind of accidentally began the paranormal investigation thing because once my mom started offering her services as an animal communicator, people began coming to her because we're a very small town. Word travels. So people began coming to her like, my house is haunted. Can you help with that? And she's like, no, but my son can. So I'm like 15, 16 going to people's houses, talking to their dead people, and like finding weird spirit creatures in their closet. And I'm like, I don't know what this is, but it needs to go. And that's how I started. I learned by doing. I had no idea what was going on. But I went in and had good success with it and just continued. So
I think that's a good mic drop moment right there. Like, I learned by doing, because
Mm-hmm.
one of the flaws that I had in my early days as a witch is, like, I thought, I need to read another book. I need to read another book. I need to read another book. And it took me ages to get the confidence to just do. And it's like, you're going to learn far more from doing one spell that backfires than you're going to learn from reading 50 books. Like, you know what I mean? So I think that's a real good teachable moment for anyone that's listening and watching. I guess, like, I wanted to kind of change gears a little bit and explore this concept of, so obviously you've written a book called American Brujeria.
Yeah.
And I'd love us to unpack that a little bit. So what's your, I guess, elevator pitch of what is your book about?
Oh, yes. So my book is about the modern folk magic that is being practiced nowadays by Mexican American people who live in the United States. The work of American Brujeria is made up of different pieces of Mexican folk belief, superstition, the different spiritual and magical paths from over there, things like curanderismo, magia, brujeria, hechiceria, all of these different types of magic that come from over there, that people bring pieces of when they immigrate to the United States, and then they pass them down to their descendants, which is us, those of us who are kind of somewhere in between, as we sort of talk about in the book, that we are no longer really Mexican, but we're also not your standard American either. We're something that's
that
kind
in
of
between
both.
space.
And whenever we have those kind of mixed race kind of liminal spaces, I talk about them in the book, we always have almost like this isolation that happens where, we're not Mexican enough to hang out with the Mexicans, but we're also not American enough to hang out with the Americans. So we end up kind of being an island unto ourselves. And whenever we have those isolated populations, we end up with our own unique forms of folk magic. And that's kind of what American Brujeria is.
That's so awesome.
I love that. Yeah, that's beautiful. I love how it's like that melting pot of different things, and you've created a space for yourself in that liminal space as you kind of bring it in there. So can you kind of tell us, I guess, a little bit of the differences, like for people who see I'm not very good with all. Thank you. You can say it much better than I can, and I want to say it good, but it doesn't sound right. Maybe like some of the differences between your kind of version, the American sort of folk magic, with some of the other more traditional and things like that kind of give us the differences, I suppose. What's the
Absolutely. So we kind of have to start with the the modern American understanding of the word witchcraft
Yeah.
or witch, because in a lot of places and kind of historically, witches were seen as a very bad thing.
Yeah.
They did
Yeah,
very awful
definitely.
types of magic. They ate babies and like all this
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
But you ask modern people, especially in the United States, what is a witch? And they're like, oh, they're someone who is a healer who is connected with the earth and is here to, dance with the spirit or whatever. Like, and that's very different from that. So we have to understand that
Yeah.
our understanding of the term witch is very different from a lot of other people's, where we put
Yeah.
a very positive spin on it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that kind of translates to a few other things. So put a pin in that and set that to the side.
Yeah.
In Mexico, brujeria is not seen as a healing, happy thing. It's often seen as a very dark, very forceful, very harsh form of magic.
Yeah.
And there are different types of traditional brujeria that you will find. In Mexico, in order to understand brujeria, you have to understand that it comes a lot from the books of Saint Cyprian, there's multiple books that come from different places. And so a lot of people work with the Portuguese one. The Mexico one is the Spanish book of Saint Cyprian, which, from what I understand, I haven't dove too far into this. It works a little bit more like the Goetia, where we are kind of calling up these spirits and making deals with them.
Yeah. Yep.
And in Mexico too, when you go to these places where you find the brujas and brujos and things like that, it's a lot of it entails a lot of animal parts. It entails people doing very unfriendly things to toads, and whatnot. So we have to understand that over there, when people call themselves a witch or a bruja, it's often not met with the same as it is in the United States, where people are like, oh, that's so cool in the United States. But here, not so much. So then we go into the United States again, where people have this passed down to them magic that is kind of Mexican or some other Latin American culture, whether they're Puerto Rican or Guatemalan or whatever. And so they start working with this kind of ancestral magic that we're all being called back to. And you ask them, what is that called? And like, what is this that you're doing? And people will say, oh, well, it's brujeria. And that's very different what they're doing, which is lighting novena candles to saints and doing sugar jars and things like that. It's very different from the traditional kind. And so but that's something that we like to do with the word witch, is we like to kind of change it a little bit. So that's why in the book I refer to it as American brujeria, because I wanted to define exactly what it was I was talking about. And I also didn't want to erase or kind of write over what traditional brujeria is. For that.
And I think that's a really important lesson for everyone to learn. Like, because I made that mistake because I have a lot of friends. People know I teach Zumba. So because of that, I know a lot of people from Latin America. So I made the mistake of, when I was talking to them, because some of them English wasn't like as fluent for them as Spanish, obviously. So when I was talking to them saying that, they're like, oh, what do you do? Because they saw me with all the crystals and everything. I'm like, oh, I'm a witch. They're like, a what? And I said, a brujo. And they're like, and they're literally like, they gasp and they're like, what the hell? I'm like, wait, did I say the wrong word?
Right.
Because I just literally took the translated word brujo. Brujo being for a boy, bruja for a girl, or I think you on your Instagram introduced a brujex as a modern day term for it. Gender neutral or gender non-binary, is that brujex? Yeah. So I use that word just because I translated it using Google, not realizing that word, it carries so much more meaning than a simple translation of witch, because I'm applying my modern day lens on that word rather than respecting the word for where it came from. So I think it's a really important lesson for everyone. And I know you mentioned a few other little terms in there. Now, whilst I can speak very basic Spanish, I'm not going to embarrass myself with trying to say them all. So you said magia, you said brujeria. There was another one that's a really long one.
The curanderismo.
That's the one. What do those words mean, just for our non-Spanish speaking listeners?
Yeah, so we have, so the way they basically translate is, we have the brujeria, which is witchcraft. We have the magia, which is magic. We have hechiceria, which is sorcery. And then we have curanderismo, which is like the folk healing of it. So those are some of, and there's more than that, but those are the main ones.
Yeah. And I guess the other one that often comes up in conversation is Santeria, which a lot of people associate with things like Dia de los Muertos, because, and this is not my very far removed Australian understanding of Santeria. It's like that kind of crossover between a lot of what you're speaking about with the Catholicism and like the veneration of saints and things like that. Is that correct? Please correct me if I'm wrong.
A little bit. They look similar, and so I understand why people sometimes confuse them, but they're very different in practice. So what Santeria is, as I understand, is it came from a place called Yoruba in Africa. And when they brought over the African people on the slave trade that ended up in places like Cuba and Puerto Rico, they had to then, which were all Spanish colonized, where they were all then converted to Catholicism. Well, that was a very rapid conversion that happened there. And so what ended up happening was these very powerful African deities known as the Orisha ended up having to be disguised somehow. They're holding on to their spirits and going, okay, we have to put these somewhere so that they won't be seen. And so we end up synchronizing them with saints. So for instance, I believe in Santeria, if you're talking about Saint Barbara, you're actually talking about a spirit called Chango, because both of these saints both of these spirits or stories deal with lightning. So they line them up with one another. And so in Santeria, when they're talking about saints, they are actually meaning an African spirit in disguise. When it comes to the work that I do, though, when I'm talking about Catholic saints, I'm talking about Catholic saints.
Catholic saints.
Interesting.
And that confuses people really badly. But when it comes to Catholicism, that's all very much encouraged. You know, if I always go back to Kathleen Madigan has a stand-up set called Bothering Jesus, where she talks about when you're Catholic, you don't go straight to Jesus. He has things to do, right? You go to the saint in charge of the activity that is giving you trouble and you ask them for help. And so, but that ends up looking like magic, you know? I'm looking for a husband, so I light a candle and ask Saint Anthony or Saint Anne to bring me a man. And then, but that's not technically witchcraft. We're not gonna,
that's right, we're not there.
Catholicism, but we can see where we're going there.
Yes. Yeah.
But I love this because there's often this I like to say separation of church and state. Like, you know, it's this separation between religious practice and witchcraft. But in some instances, there is this beautiful way that you can weave the two together. Like, and this is like the first time I've ever had a conversation with someone else that does similar. Like, I have still held on to my Orthodox like upbringing and whatnot. So I still have my Orthodox saints that I refer to, which are the same as the Catholic saints. It's just different way of honoring them. And like, there's not a lot of people that will do that. They think that once they take on witchcraft, they denounce all forms of Christianity because they think it's like separate. But I love the way that you're able to just weave the two together and same, but different. Like, you know what I mean? It's just so beautiful. So have you ever had any backlash from any Catholics or people that you've come across for your practices?
I do have sometimes Christian people will find my Instagram and see what I do and then send me a message trying to school me in the scripture, and that does not go well for them because they don't realize I also read the Bible.
I know what it says.
And I'm like, actually, like, none of that counts because like I get very into it with them, and I end up actually with quite a few people who come at me trying to educate me leaving going, well, I'm going to need to think about that. I'm like,
hang on.
Right? Because honestly, the Bible has more magic in it than a Tolkien novel. I mean, it sounds
really
like when you read the Bible, it's just it's everywhere.
And I guess to flip it and reverse the other side of the coin, though, have you had any? I guess because I see it a lot on Facebook over here that there's when you have Christian witches. And from the the pagan or the secular witches, they kind of they push Christian witches to the side as if to say, no, you're not really practicing witchcraft because you're still holding on to your Christian belief system. Have you ever had that happen from either secular or pagan or non-Christian believers?
I haven't had it directly happen to me, but I have been in situations where I've realized that I'm going to have to not explain or bring up what exactly it is that I do. So I went to a convention, oh gosh, a couple of years now, because it was pre-COVID. I went to the last PantheaCon, and this is still, we're coming out of it a little bit, but for the longest time, the terms pagan and witch were basically synonymous with one another. You know, you had to be both at the same time. And so being in that climate, not only was there a lot of people still unpacking the baggage from their Christian upbringing, but there was a lot of people not ready at all to have any of those conversations. So there was someone there who was presenting on La Santa Muerte, and part of her veneration is very heavily Catholic, where, you know, there's a rosary to her and there's, you know, novena candles to her and all of this. And someone came up to me talking about how upset they were that this person brought up Catholicism in the Santa Muerte class. And they got very upset and we're talking about, if I wanted to go to church, I'd go to church and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, but you can't leave that out when talking about La Santa Muerte. It's like, no, that's very integral part of this. So I have felt very out of place in several instances.
It can be so tricky to navigate sometimes, especially when, because this is like why I'm glad we're having this conversation, because it's just an organic flow, but it's like there are going to be so many people out there that will be struggling with that reconciliation within themselves, that think that they have to denounce one to embrace the other, and vice versa. And I just love that we're like touching on this, because it's I think it's poignant, especially in today's day and age with the stuff that I'm seeing on Facebook, because it's important for us to give voices to everybody. So then I guess in regards to the practice itself, is what you do considered an open or closed practice? Because that's another debate I see a lot of the times when we start talking folk magic. There's often this, for lack of a better term, gatekeeping that happens with no, you can't, because I'm hereditary, you can't just start doing this, or like, and then there's certain things that people think, oh, I really like that, I'm going to adopt that because I'm eclectic, but then they don't realize that there's certain things that you just shouldn't touch. So what's your view on that when it comes to what you do or the greater?
My view on specifically what I've been calling American Brujeria is that it is an open practice. But we have to have a conversation. And I do this in my book a little bit, where I have a whole section in the first chapter where I say, you know, can people who are non-Mexicans utilize this magic? And the answer is yes, but. And we have to examine a few things. The first thing we have to ask ourselves is why? You know, why are we wanting to use this? Are we wanting to use this because, you know, we really feel an intense connection to it, or, you know, why are we here? And kind of once we suss that out, then we can move on to the next, which is asking yourself, you know, what is your relationship like with Mexican people? You know, are you supporting them with how you speak and how you spend your money and how you vote? Things like that. You know, that's very important, especially us here in the United States, where we share a border with them. How we vote very much impacts them and their well-being. Especially the people who are here too already, not just the people in Mexico, but both it affects. And then once we understand that, then we have to go into the cultural appropriation conversation. And that's such a confusing place right now, because the words like cultural appropriation and closed practice are just getting thrown onto everything because they're buzzwords, right? So people like to throw these out. I've been told that Christianity is a closed practice, which is hilarious. I've been told that plant magic is a closed practice. So it really depends these days on who you ask. However, when it comes to this one, when it comes to cultural appropriation, I simply have people ask themselves 3 questions. The first question is, does this make you money? If it's making you money, we might need to refocus. We might need to look into it a little bit more. We might need to just review that. And the second one is does it take up space? and this is something that we find as Native American people too, is we go to something like a sweat lodge or a ceremony from our people, and we're the only Native person there, including the person leading the ceremony. So sometimes when too much space is taken up, we can feel alienated inside our own cultures. So that's something to kind of consider. And then the third one is, does it erase culture? And this one's a tricky one because people don't always notice that they're doing it. And normally when they do it this way, it's in order to make something easier or to make it more marketable. So going back to the topic of Santeria, if you're going to join Santeria, there's a process to it. You need to find somebody who's going to be able to mentor you. You need to have certain divinations done to make sure that the spirits even want you. And then once that's done, then there's training and there's initiations and things like that. But people want the spells and they want the spirits, but they don't want to put in the work. So people just go, you know what, I can't afford that, or that's not in my area. So I'm going to skip it and go straight to lighting candles to Oshun. And then they teach other people that they can do that, and that erases culture. So when it comes to culture appropriation, just ask yourselves those three questions. And if you answer no, honestly, to all three, then you're probably fine. I have people calling me and telling me that they're sad they can't drink margaritas anymore because they're from Mexico and it's cultural appropriation. And I'm like, no, drink your margarita.
Have a margarita.
Yeah, no, it's totally fine. That's totally fine.
Oh my God.
I love that.
No, because I think it's a very poignant discussion to have, and it's because it's something that has come up so many times. Like I've even seen people saying like we can't use the word smudging anymore because that's culturally appropriated from Native American culture. Like now people are calling it smoking ceremonies, but then here in Australia you can't call it that because that's actually a term used for Indigenous Australians. Like when we say smoking ceremony, like it's a very specific ceremony that you do as an Indigenous person from here. So then people are like, well, what do I call it then? Am I just blessing and consecrating my house with smoke? Like, feel a word so that you don't offend someone or don't, So it's a very tricky one to navigate.
It is, but it's a nice, and it's a nice thing that you have there with those three questions to be able to kind of navigate that a little bit better.
Yeah, kind of help people get like putting bumpers on it so that people don't get too far off the track. It's a little helper there.
We can also almost call it cultural appropriation for dummies.
Yeah, right. A crash course.
With this 3-step process, you can find out if you culturally appropriate. No, I'm just kidding. So I want to go back to your book though, because obviously we've mentioned it a few times. So what can people expect to find in your book?
You can expect to find a little bit of background on what it is like to be a Mexican American person, or really anyone of mixed race. I've had a lot of people who are like, I am not even Mexican American. People who are being like, I'm half black, half white, or I'm here and I'm half Asian, or I'm Asian American. That people are understanding what it's like to be a person who is of mixed race. And so we talk about that a lot in the first chapter about finding power in it as something that's a really important place to be, because a lot of times we feel very isolated as people who are in between, but we don't realize that we are bridges between worlds. And it's so important that we are here because we can unite two very different people and kind of be that go-between of this healing between these two different people. So just understanding how important that is. We talk a lot about family tradition, and the things that I really love is I get so many messages every day from people who are like, this helped me understand and connect with my family. People who are like, I thought that my grandma was just nuts, and now I read your book and I'm like, oh, that's where this comes from. Like now I get why she's tying red ribbons on her aloe plant, and understanding that. And so people are having this deeper connection with their families, and they're getting to go to their families and being like, have you seen this before? And their family's like, oh my gosh, yes, I have seen something like this before. And then they get to have something to talk about, which is great. But what we do in the book is we go over different spirits. We talk about Guadalupe, we talk about La Santa Muerte, we talk about novena candle magic, we talk about all kinds of different spells, which we call hechizos. I teach you how to make your own oils, do divination, all kinds of stuff. I threw everything into this book. word counts at 65,000 words, and I turned in a manuscript that was like 6,000 or 64,999 words.
Wow.
I crammed as much into this book as I could, because I didn't want there to be anything that people were left without. I wanted people to feel like if they could just have one book, that this would get them through for years, or that they could come back to and find a different section that they didn't know about before, or things like that. So that was important for me.
Have you given yourself an option of a part 2 or a follow-up or a sequel or something? Or have you used it all?
I hesitate to say no, because I might have another one in me on the Mexican folk magic. But I wanted to do this. This project is really important to me, but I think it might be my only one of Mexican folk magic, because I wanted to blaze that trail of somebody from the community actually writing about their own magic, which this was one of the very first books that did that. And now I'm seeing more interest in it. People are realizing, oh, people do want to hear about this, want to learn about this. And so I have another friend, her name is Daphne, and she's like the real deal bruja from Mexico, and I've been working with her, and she's just gotten a book deal through Wiser as well. So her book is coming out in 2022, and I'm so looking forward to it kind of being the follow-up to mine, because she can give you even more depth than I ever could. And so I'm just so excited to see what comes, like what comes out behind me, like
that
like what
stepping
happens.
stone. That stepping stone for someone else. That's awesome.
Because especially to be a trailblazer, I mean, if there's a legacy that you can leave in your life, it's that. It's
that's
that
the
you
one.
open the doors for others to then also feel that, holy shit, my voice can actually be heard. There's a space for me to discuss what I do. And there's not that there's a market for it, but you know what I mean? Like there's people out there who want to hear it. Because I know when I travel with my husband, he always giggles and laughs every time we go somewhere, because I have to balance his Capricorn side of just wanting to go and enjoy being away and being on holidays and switching off from the world, with my Cancerian side who needs to go to all the temples and all the religious and all the little, like, I'm the guy that will literally find some, like when I was in New Mexico, I was in God, now I'm trying to remember what place I was in, Santa Fe, and there was actually a group of I don't want to say the wrong thing, I believe they were Navajo. So they were sitting in like a Navajo craft market, so all Native Americans. And I went up to them, and even though it was a craft market, this is the thing, like, I'm not just going to go out and buy some cutesy little Navajo-esque thing from some little store that's owned by a non-Indigenous person. I will go to the artisans, and I'll go up to them. And when I looked at some of the jewelry that they were selling and stuff, I actually asked them, can you explain what this is to me, where this comes from, what it does, like da. Because for me, it's all about, like, I want to pay them, one, because I know that that's a source of income, and two, it gives me an opportunity to learn. And so I know when I'm wearing that bracelet, I know what the little design with the beads on my bracelet means, and I know what that connects to, and I make sure I have that conversation with them. So it's funny that when I travel, it's like I always want to find the cutesy little thing. So like people look at me, they're like, oh my God, you've got so many things from different cultures on your display and what you wear. And some people have actually come to me and said, oh, that's cultural appropriation. I said, I got it from the source, back off.
Right, it's supporting these people. It's very interesting to see how we've gone around the bend from, we need to support Indigenous communities by not appropriating from them, and now we can't buy anything from them at all. And so it goes around to, we're supporting them so much that we can't support them anymore. And I ran into that on TikTok with books by Mexican people, because I posted this thing that was like, here are my favorite books on Mexican magic that are written by Mexican people. And suddenly this huge influx of comments came in from people being like, and if you are not Mexican, you can't buy these, never touch these, never read these, never look at these. And I'm like, whoa.
Where did that go?
Yeah, I'm like, first of all, these authors did not write this book so that nobody would read them.
Yeah.
That is not why we're here.
That's not why people are writing
like,
books.
So you really should be buying these, because it's very hard to not only find Mexican folk magic books, but ones written by people in the community that are accurate. That's really difficult. So to support these people is really important. And also, it's not a bad thing to understand and learn about other cultures. That's really important. And it's actually been shown that once we learn about and understand other cultures, we're less likely to be racist against them because we understand them. And so it's actually a really, really good thing when people buy things like, I have people ask me all the time, they're like, I'm not Mexican, but can I buy your book so that I can understand more? And I'm like, yes, absolutely. That is what it is there for.
Yeah, yes, buy it and then buy more and give them to your friends.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid to actually support these communities and these artists and these authors. It's very important.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I have had your book on my to buy list for a long time. It's been a struggle to find someone in Australia that stocks it. I can order it from America, but then it's like such a long time. But then now there's a part of me that's thinking, I'm like, had I just pre-ordered it from America, it would be here by now.
Yeah, that's right.
But no, I do want to read it because it's something that's very fascinating to me. Having a lot of friends from Latin America and from Mexico, I happened to be over in the US in San Francisco during Dia de los Muertos, and I was talking to some of my Mexican friends and learning a little bit about it, and it kind of sparked that interest in me. Because those that know me know I have a little, similar to what you just said, I have a little motto that, because I read a lot, and everyone's like, why do you read so much about so many random topics? Because if you looked at my bookshelf, it's every topic under the sun. And I say to them, well, for me, knowledge leads to understanding. Understanding leads to tolerance. Tolerance leads to acceptance, and acceptance leads to unconditional love. So through that kind of process, if I read about it and learn about it, then I can only love it eventually, when I get to the other end. So it's like, it's impossible to hate something if you know something about it. You know what I mean? So it's a testament to what you just said about, like, just go out there and read a book, connect with someone. I mean, message you on Instagram. That's how this happened. But yeah, so no, I think this was an amazing conversation.
It is. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me on.
No, this has been awesome. So guys, if you want to check it out, so guys, girls, and everything in between, I need to stop saying guys. If you want to check out his book, you can find it in all major book publishers. I mean, you can support things like Amazon if you want to get a shit from the US. Obviously, there's other ways you can find it. So it's American.
You now we can.
I do that too.
American Brujeria by J. Alan Cross. So check him out, and
we'll pop all the links under.
Oh, absolutely! All the links will be above or below, depending on which platform.
Which way you
get us. Yes. But I hope we get to speak to you again in the future.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. It's been amazing.
Okay. See you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.